Again, so last time we talked about, we ended with the three estates, and as I mentioned, this is how we look at things. Normally, if you grew up in a traditional or even a Christian background or household, it's that you see yourself as an individual who is part of a family and then part of a larger community of the church and then of society. That's how we usually think of ourselves and how we relate to one another. That's the relationship. But as I said, like, this is completely different from what we see today. So the things that we mentioned earlier, the riots, the bonfires, and all these gender identity problems and issues came out of basically postmodernism. Let's put this on the board. How many of you know what postmodernism is?
Dr. Modernism.
Very good.
Institutions and ideology that constitute kind of the fundamentals of modern Western society.
That's right. So, yeah. And did you get all of that? Yeah. So, yeah, okay. So, and as Bill said, it's something that happened after modernism. So, maybe we should sort of define what modernism is. What is modernism? Or what is modernity? What is modernity? We are in postmodernism. We are the future. No, seriously, what is modernity?
Scientific path and reason, enlightenment.
Enlightenment. So that was, as I've said many times before, I'm not an expert in history. And so what I'm talking about here is just a very, very basic overview of world history and things like that. So if you want to understand more and know more, you should go to Wikipedia. Sorry. That's my website. So modernity is basically from 1700s and on, thereabouts, lasting for about 200 years or so. And that's, we still have some of it, but as I said, we are in postmodern times now. So modernity is when science flourished, and everything, or the philosophy behind modernity is that science and human reason can solve everything. If we just study it long enough and have enough time, then we can understand everything and solve everything. That's basically what modernity is. Okay? And so that's why, at that time you see Darwinianism flourishing. And that led to other issues, which is, along with pietism, also that's when it started. So people started to think at that time anyway, that we don't really need religion, because the findings of Darwin seems to suggest that there is no God after all. And so there's this idea of evolution that developed in all aspects of academia, basically. So there is an evolution of biology, there's an evolution also of religion. So it's the idea that because, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago too, it's the idea that because ancient people know nothing, they're stupid, and so they just explain all these natural phenomena through gods and things. Right? So now we know better, we know how things work, so there is no God. There is no Zeus that's causing these thunder and lightning. We know what it is, right? What is lightning? Yeah. So it's not Zeus in the skies doing his thing, right? It's just a physical discharge. So we have this idea. Now, And that lasted for about 200 years or so. So that's modernity. Now we come to postmodernism. And if you read, if you do some research, most people will say that postmodernism started in the 50s, 1950s. But it really started in the 40s. Now, what happened around the 40s? Second World War. And even 10 years or so before that, we have the first. Well, yeah, no.
1914, 1918.
Yeah, about 20 years or so before that, we have the First World War. And so after these two wars, it devastated the world, right? And so people started to wonder whether mankind is really that great. So again, going back to modernity, is the idea that man can solve everything. Because we're progressing so fast, they thought they can do everything with their minds, with their logic and reason. And then what happens? We have these two great wars. And so people started to question whether man is really that great. So that's the beginning of postmodernism. And along with that, then we have, as Nicholas described, it's basically a critique of the previous era, the modern era. And so with that, now it's not a complete rejection of modernity. It's a development variation of it, if you will. So we have some of these, a few things, some characteristics that characterizes postmodernism. So I'll list some here, and then I'll discuss some of them. So we have, let's see, the first thing that's really common is relativism. There'll be a lot of isms, because it's really a bunch of ideologies, and it's not in the study. As I mentioned, for those of you who are not here, as I mentioned last time, so this study is really incomplete. It does mention some of the very recent issues, such as the maid thing, and the gender issues, but it really doesn't go deep in. This is my critique of this. And I was talking to another pastor, I was telling him I'm using this, and he says, why are you using this? This is such a bad. I was like, well, I'm using it because I want to talk about these. And also this itself is also a case study too. Because you may recognize, some of these questions are really framed under these philosophies. And so it's really interesting how we are so affected by these that we don't even know we are affected by it. And now, also I have to say, postmodernism is not entirely bad. There are some good things that came out of it. We, to be critical, to have a critical mind, to have a critical way of thinking is a product of postmodernism. And that's a good thing. To question things, that's a good thing. But then, when it goes beyond its limit, then that's the problem. And that's what happens, or that's what we are seeing today as it develops over time. And so, relativism, what is this? What is this against?
Whatever I say goes.
Pretty much, yes.
I can decide what's right for me. Nobody has the right to tell me I'm doing anything wrong.
So this is in relation to absolute truth. So when we talk about postmodernism, one of the first character of postmodernism is the relative, there is no absolute truth. And so when you talk to people who are affected deeply by postmodernism, when you talk about Christianity, where that is based on absolute truth, they reject it. Because the premise, the underlying principle is that there is no absolute truth. Although, if you think about it, that statement itself is an absolute truth. So it's in itself an oxymoronic statement. When you say there is no absolute truth, you are stating an absolute truth. But they don't, if you point that out to them, they will just ignore you and pretend they didn't hear you. And that's part of the attitude too. It's not just a way of thinking; it's an attitude, right? That everything is relative. There's no absolute truth. So my truth can be true, and your truth can be true, even though what we say can be mutually exclusive. And it's fine. And that's how we are living now today. And that's just the way it is. Okay, so that's one thing. And you'll see how that leads to the things that we're seeing today, or last year at least. We're still, 2021 is still young, and it's still cold, and so people are, staying home. But when it's warm enough, I don't know. The other thing is, so this is, I guess it's related, it's subjectivism. Basically, it's the same thing. Subjectivism as opposed to objective truth. So these two are related. Relativism and subjectivism are somewhat related. Subjectivism is when the subject, that is the person, the self, determines what is true. So they go together, right? So I determine what is true. And it's not just that I determine what is true. It's really based on emotions. And so that's why when you look at these current issues, and when you try, if you have friends like these, and when you try to have a reasonable discussion with them, it's really hard, because it's not based on reason anymore. So again, postmodernism is really a reaction against modernism, which is really highly reasonable way of thinking about philosophy. And so to go against it means that you have to be subjective, very emotional. And so also another thing that you may notice is when you talk to people, they often like to say, I feel this is true. But it's not based on any facts. But it's based on your feeling, and so it must be true. So it can be true for you. So that's part of this problem here. When everything is relative, there's no objective truth. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. Good. The other thing is, so because of this, what we have is revisionism. How many of you have heard of this? It's a relatively new term. No? Wow. Just a few of them. Revisionism. So what is it?
That's why all the statues are being torn down. That's why all the statues are being torn down.
It's historical revisionism. Really, that's behind that one. So, related to this is deconstructionism. Deconstructionism. Okay, what is this? Deconstructionism. Deconstructionism.
Attempting to tear down fundamental ideas or historical narratives or important cultural aspects of our society. It started with textual deconstructionism, but it has expanded since then into all kinds of deconstructionism. What that means originally is when you read, so the idea is when you study a text, under deconstructionism there is a distinction between the text itself versus the meaning. So it can say one thing, but it actually means something else. That's deconstructionism. And that's part of, like when you put all of these things together, that's what you get. So you read, like, I mentioned this before, like for example, when we read in the Bible, for example, Jesus goes to Nazareth. The word says Jesus goes to Nazareth, but it doesn't mean what it says. That's deconstructionism. Why is that? Because it's subjective. I don't feel what the word says is what it says. It means something else because I feel that's what it means. And also because the Bible and any other basically literature or document is really there's no absolute truth in those things, and so therefore I determine what is true. And I feel that when it says Jesus went to Nazareth, it doesn't really mean that he went there. He actually went to somewhere else. Who knows where. And so that's how all these things work together in postmodernism, in its one of the grossest forms. So that's why today, these things started in the 50s and 60s, and at that time it wasn't a big deal because it just started. But as time progressed, there are more people who adhere to this or who accepted these things and developed further, and this is what we see. So that's why today you have a lot of people using terms that they just like to use them without actually understanding its meanings. For example, one of the current ones is the word genocide. What is it being used, or what is it being asked to be used? The most recent one, the word genocide.
And the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah, what does the word genocide mean? So you don't even know.
Well, it's mass.
No, it's
Massacre. Massacre. Now, are the Chinese government actually massacring the Uyghur people? It's not quite.
They're putting them in concentration camps.
They are putting in concentration camps, but they're not actually massively killing them. They're re-educating. Now, I'm not saying it's good. It's a good thing. I'm not saying that. But my point here is, when we use language, we have to be as precise as possible. That's what language is supposed to be. It's to convey ideas and exchange information so we understand each other. When you don't do that, when you use words, however you want, then it's confusing for
They lose their meaning.
It loses its meaning, and we're not achieving what language is supposed to be for. So that's one thing. So the word genocide is often thrown around these days. Whenever there's some kind of persecution, then people will say, "Oh, that's a genocide." No, it's not. And last time I also told you, also mentioned that to be a Christian is about the truth. Christians love the truth, and we need to be able to stand up and say, this is true, this is not true. And so that's why we're doing this. So that's one thing. Another problem that we've been seeing is the gender pronouns. They invented all these new terms, and then they say, oh, these are actually not new invented terms. They are from the 16th century. No, they're not. Right? The word Z. How many of you know this? Z-E. Z. That's supposed to replace he or she. So it's for trans people. So if you don't identify yourself as a he or she, male or female, then you may use Z.
But there's a correction on that. They use a binary code because where I work, we're talking about inclusion, and they're actually putting in your email signature he /she /they.
They,
Yeah.
yeah. And if you actually Google it, gender pronouns, it's not just he, she, they, Z, right? There are actually 10 other ones that they like to use, and they're all made up words. Although if you look up in the dictionaries, you will find a definition for this. But my point is, people are making up new words that actually don't mean anything in the language.
At this point, it's more pronouns than proverbs.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is another thing that came out of these ideas, or these philosophies or ideologies. Okay. So it's a really so in terms of practicality, this is what happens when people apply these philosophies. This is what happens. People deconstruct everything. So also because of deconstructionism, you have this anti-government sentiment, anti-religion sentiment as well, because you want to deconstruct everything that is of the old world, like from modernity. So that's why we see this, right? We see people who are against the government, against any kind of authority and religion, basically. Okay, so that's a very basic overview of postmodernism. Any question or comments about this? As I say, if you want to read more, you can go to Wikipedia.
Or get one of Gene Veith's books.
Yeah, that's right. Gene
Edward Veith.
Gene Edward Veith. He's somewhat of an expert on it. He's a Lutheran layperson in the LCMS, but he has written a lot of books on these topics for lay people. So it's if you want to.
He was a professor at
He
one
was
of
an
the
English
Concordia colleges.
professor.
He's emeritus now. And if you get the Lutheran Witness, he has a column at the beginning of each issue.
Most of us don't get the Lutheran Witness, however, because you have to pay. It's us that gets
Yeah.
the thing free. But anyway, yeah, maybe I'll photocopy.
Actually, I scan it, so if anybody wants it, I could.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure, yeah. You can
Or I could-
email me and then I'll make copies.
Yeah, I can email you each copy after I scan it, and then you
Yeah, that's
can
great.
do whatever you like.
Yeah, that would be good. Thank you. So that's really the overall atmosphere of our day. Yes.
Like, will we cover, what is it? Different types in like the church with mysticism, etc., or is this more so going to be just sort of crappy world?
I didn't catch it. Can you repeat?
Like with the postmodernism, like will we touch upon like mysticism and other stuff like within churches, or is it going to be more so just about the world?
Just about the world. Yeah, the mysticism aspect is, yeah, I suppose it is related. They call it New Age, but if you look at if you actually look at the New Age movement and all that, it's actually Eastern religions, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism. But they rebranded it, if you will.
Yeah, it's
They
Western.
rebranded it so that it doesn't sound old.
It's also westernized.
Yeah.
I mean, they changed a little bit, like you're allowed to eat meat because they wouldn't want you to think that if you went to McDonald's you were eating your grandmother or something like that, so they had to change that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've seen this commercial, it's funny. The commercial is, you see a priest, a monk, a Buddhist monk, he sneezed. And then he grabbed a tissue and blows in it. And then he looks at the box. It says it kills 99% of the germs. And he freaked out. Yeah, so I guess they didn't take into account that germs are also living organisms. Your ancestor could be a germ. Who knows? Yeah. Now, I don't know, the scientific community is still debating on this, but some people think viruses are living organisms. Some people don't think they are. So, I don't know about that, but certainly bacteria are living things. And so, if you believe in Buddhism and reincarnation, then your ancestors could be one of those in the notes. Anything about you? Anyway.
I do not intend to talk about mysticism in relation to postmodernism, because it does affect us, but not as much as the current issues in terms of a social way. New Age is really too far from Christianity that we don't really need to.
It's a pretty common staple in evangelical churches.
Is it?
Yeah, like in past openings.
I don't know.
I mean, like even stuff like that, like what's God trying to tell me, or like I feel the Holy Spirit today, like that.
That predates postmodernism. It came in that way of thinking that God speaks to us in a mystical way apart from the scripture. This way of thinking was already present during the Reformation, 500 years ago. This is not new.
Yeah, but like it's getting like that, and like if we read the same passage, going around and comparing several, like what do you think that God told you through this passage? Like if you get a
Oh yeah, that happens too. Well, obviously it is like, as I said, postmodernism has affected all of them. We are born in a postmodern society and world. Like we have not escaped it. We cannot escape it, and we don't need to escape it. As I said, it's not entirely bad. It's just that we need to recognize what is bad and what is right, and live accordingly. So yeah, I've been to those Bible studies too. We read a Bible passage, and at the end of the thing, we had a heated debate. And at the end, one says, "Yeah, that's your interpretation," and that's really how it ended. Because with that, like, how can you debate on that? You cannot debate anymore. And even when I say that it's a fact, like, it's not accepted. Because other people did not feel that it's the right interpretation, but it is. It's it. Now, at that time, it was not attestable, but still, it's based on fact. And so, again, but when you go with relativism and subjectivism, facts don't matter. You can present millions of facts, and it doesn't matter. That's what postmodernism is about, unfortunately. And so it's a weird thing for Christians to live in a postmodern world, because we do care about facts and truth and absolute truth. And so that's why Christianity clashes with postmodernism. And that's why, when you see these things on the news, it's really weird, to say the least. Okay, so that's that. Okay, that's in a very, very basic, general overview of postmodernism. Now, another thing that is happening is not material. Wow, this is so. Yeah. Pretend you don't see that word. The other thing is Marxism.
Religion is the opium of the masses.
Religion is the opium, yeah. Now, Marxism predates postmodernism. Marxism is like in the 1800s, right?
Yeah.
So way before postmodernism. However, his stuff, like his philosophies, like his later stuff, or the later stuff that are related to Marxism, have traction with postmodernism, and this is something that's very fascinating. So, anyway, now Marxism, what is Marxism?
It's based on Karl Marx wrote the book Das Kapital, and he had this idea that I didn't read Das Kapital, so I don't know exactly, but basically is everybody is in a cooperative, like and there's no hierarchy, everybody is the same, there's no wealth, there's no, everybody's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Marx, together with Engels, wrote a couple of books, Das Kapital being the biggest one and most significant one, where he lays out this way of understanding history materially. And he has this fundamental understanding of the way that humans relate to each other, that we conflict, that members of society are at odds with one another over the means of production or the material way that we live. And so he said that capitalist European and American society in the 19th century was under this fundamental struggle between the bourgeois or owning class and the working class or the proletariat. And people have used that analysis for things other than economic analysis, but the basic idea is there are classes in society and they are at some kind of war or at odds with one another.
So, did you all catch that? Yeah, if not, go to No, so basically, under like the Marxism, this philosophy, but this ideology is that within the economic system, within the society, when you look at the economic system or a society, it's basically categorized between the bourgeoisie or the people who have wealth and those who don't have wealth. So basically, to put it in a simpler term, is the rich and the poor. That's really how he looks at the world. And that's the fundamental principle, is how do you look at the world? It's a world between, it's a struggle between the rich and the poor. That's really what it is. And the purpose is to erase, or try to erase this disparity, this conflict, by various means. So I'm not going to go into that. So that's again, very generally, or very basically, this is what Marxism is. All right. So that led to what we have today as socialism. Okay. What is socialism?
Something Donald Trump abhors.
Now, socialism is, to my knowledge, is in every, basically, to some degree, it's in every aspect of Western civilization. We do have this implemented to some degree, one way or the other. For example, in our current, the Canadian medical system, it is a socialism implementation of socialism. So the idea is when everybody contributes to the common good and everybody receives the same level of benefit. That's what in general, socialism, that's what it is. So when everybody, regardless of how much, like, everybody contributes as much as they can, and everybody receives the same benefit. So let's say I pay, so this is how it works, right? In our system, we pay taxes, but our taxes is based on our income, so it's different, right? The amount of taxes we pay are different according to each individual. However, the benefits that you receive from the government in terms of healthcare are the same, correct? That's an aspect of socialism. Okay. So with that, within socialism, then it got into different types of socialism. So we have communism, and within communism we have Maoism, that's in China, and then there's Stalinism, and Leninism, I think that's the word, and things like that. So how you implement this, the idea is good, right? That's why it's called an ideology. It's an ideal. But when you're dealing with sinners, a bunch of sinners, and when you give them power, right, it doesn't work well. So the problem with this is that, so the idea is everybody contribute and then we distribute. So we can all contribute to this thing, whatever the benefit, whatever it is, and then we distribute this evenly. The idea behind then, the question then is who decides how to do this? Well, usually it's the government, right? But then in our system, it's a democratic government. But it's still flawed, right? But it's, better than nothing. But when you put all the power in one central system, namely, like for example, communism, then you have this huge problem. They try to make it equal, but then obviously, how many of you have read Animal Farm? Yeah, great book. And at that time when I read it, I was like, I don't know, 15, 16, I didn't really understand it. But I still remember that one line. How many of, okay, so a few of you. So Animal Farm is basically, how would you call it, parody?
It's a metaphor. It's a
metaphor or
it's a
satire
of
of this socialism thing, of communism. And basically it's a bunch of animals and they try to make life better in the farm. But then who has all the power? Okay. The pigs. And so the pigs were telling the other animals, right? Everybody, I don't remember exactly, but basically they said, all are equal, all people are equal, but some are more equal. I still remember that line because it's so ironic, and that's exactly what happened in communism. So now, that's really the basic principle in this thing, socialism. Okay, any questions so far? Now, it really doesn't have anything specific, maybe it does. The next thing under that is called critical race theory. Yeah, I know. I'll just mention it and let you think about it and I'll let you research. So the next thing under that is critical race theory. Ooh. I haven't used a pen for a while. This is a HH. Critical race theory. How many of you have heard of this? Someone, yes. Stay tuned for the next episode. Critical race theory. Yeah, so if you're really interested, you should look it up. What we see today, and especially as I mentioned last year, all that crap is from this. And its principles are very similar to Marxism and socialism. But now, in terms of Marxism and socialism, it's in terms of economics. So the rich against the poor. In critical race theory, it's not the rich and the poor. It's a category of races. So it's the white people against the other people, minorities. That's what critical race theory is all about. And as you know, you can see the word critical, and it comes from these two aspects. And I'll talk about that next time, because that's really the gist of all the things that we're seeing today in our society, which is really chaotic. And if you want to think about it too, why is this so popular? Why is this thing so popular? Now this is what we see, right? And all these things under it, we talk about that next time. But why are these things so popular? Think about it. So we'll end here, and let's pray, and let's go. Oh Heavenly Father, we thank you once again that you have brought us together into your house to hear again the good news of your Son's resurrection. That he did not stay in the tomb, but came out victorious over sin, death, and the devil. And now he gives that same victory and life to us all. And so guard us by your Spirit and by the Word, so that we too may come into this world and not fear it, but be able to stand firm in your Word and in your truth. And abide with us until the end as we walk in this life. Be with us and continue to bless us. And so we pray all these
through your Son Jesus Christ.